So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're really excited to have Lori with us tonight. She's a mental performance consultant with Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic, and she also works with our national gymnastics team. And tonight she's going to be talking to us about how to return to sport, return to training, and the psychological implications that go with that. And this has been a topic that's been requested by coaches, especially with some sports going back to playing and practicing right now. So we're excited to hear from Lori, and just a reminder to stick to the chat box with any questions, and we'll open up for a Q&A at the end. But Lori, you can take it away from here.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. So just a little reminder or kind of preface. I'll be going over some content and slides for probably about a half hour or so, and then there'll be plenty of time to discuss if you have any specific questions or want me to elaborate on any content that I'm going to go through the slides. So I first want to kind of acknowledge all my colleagues across the country on contributing to the content of this presentation. So myself and Dr. Amélie Soula, who is the lead mental performance consultant at INS in Montreal, she and I collaborated on the content specifically on this presentation, as we've done a couple presentations nationally and locally on this particular topic. And we also have a national COVID task force of mental performance consultants and mental health practitioners who've reviewed and kind of gone over the content. So this is definitely a team effort for this content. We're trying to have a kind of consistent messaging across the country, particularly at the NSO National Team Athletes, and we're happy to share it with coaches and athletes at all different levels. So hopefully you can take something away. But again, this is kind of content from a lot of people, and today I have the opportunity and privilege to be your messenger. So we'll get right to it, talking about the mental aspect of returning to training and returning to sport participation. We've taken kind of a phase framework, and I know phases have been, kind of this popular approach, whether it's return to the economy, return to sport. In the last few months, we've talked a lot about phases, so we're kind of sticking to this type of approach. The mental side of returning to sport participation, it's really important to understand that it's complicated, it's complex, and it's going to vary across all individuals. So athletes, coaches, staff, parents, whomever you might be interacting with. And how people are going to kind of react mentally, emotionally, psychologically is going to depend on a lot of different factors. A person's personality, their experiences, the context in which they were isolated. Were they isolated on their own, with family, with elderly, grandparents, whatnot, and the sport that they practice, and the training environment which they're returning to. So athletes and coaches will experience all different kinds of comfort and motivation when returning to training. And as I mentioned, we're taking kind of a phase framework approach here, but I want you all to also recognize that everybody's going to go through these phases very differently. This is not necessarily kind of a very straightforward linear pattern. As you can see, I have here 3 phases: emotional, rational, and action phase. You might spend more time in one phase than the other. You might go back and forth and whatnot. So just keeping in mind that this is not necessarily all that straightforward. All right, we are starting with phase number 1, which we're referring to as the emotional phase. And you might have started to actually experience this particular phase, particularly if you have gone back into some form of training, or even just gone back into the general public, even a little bit more than perhaps when we were in kind of strict isolation. So again, each person, athlete or coach or staff, can experience a variety of emotion, different fears, and therefore have different behaviors and different strategies to deal with the situation. Athletes and coaches are going to experience different levels of of comfort, different levels of motivation when they return to training. We have to be aware of the large spectrum of what this might look like and understand individual differences. So the idea here is not necessarily to categorize, as I'm going to give, some potential categories here, but to think that this is kind of more like a variety of options, and a person can experience any or all of these when we think about kind of the continuum of psychological reaction or the emotional reaction. So you're going to have people who are super pumped and super happy to be back. And then you might have some individuals or yourselves who might be resistant to return. You might have individuals who are indifferent or even careless to return or about the whole situation. Individuals say, whatever, I'm not too scared or whatnot. I don't understand what all the fuss is about type of perspective. And then you might also have people who've been directly impacted by the situation, whether or not perhaps a person knows somebody who's been infected or has gone through recovery of the virus. Individuals have lost employment because of the shutdown or isolation. So there's different ways that individuals can be directly impacted. So, and again, I'll repeat here, it's important to note that you don't necessarily fit into one of these categories. You can be really happy to be back, but also a little bit worried and hesitant to come back as well. And that's all okay. That's all, quote unquote, normal or typical. The initial phase of returning, we can also expect athletes and coaches to experience different levels and different kinds of fear. So we can have the fear of resuming training. So this idea of not being up to it, not fit enough, depending on the level of sport competition athletes or coaches were participating in. There's the fear of falling ill, the fear of contracting the virus. And from my conversations with a number of coaches on a national level, I work with coaches who might be in a vulnerable population, and they're also afraid of contracting it, or they have a fear of having somebody contract the virus while they're in their care or under their supervision. So those are some legitimate fears that I've been hearing from people. And there's also this fear of being behind or missing out. Being behind their competitors, being behind in whatever goals you might have had, being behind other countries if you have athletes or you're competing against people in different situations. And this is particularly true in Canada, where each province is having different return to participation protocols. So for example, we have athletes in Ontario who are probably participating in some sports before athletes in Nova Scotia, but athletes in Nova Scotia might be participating in sport before people in Quebec. So with social media, everybody's kind of seeing where everybody's at, and that can create some fear and some anxiety as well. It's important to recognize that these differences and fears, and to have an increased emotional awareness of ourselves and everybody around us. So all of these feelings and these emotions are going to manifest themselves in different ways. So, keep an eye out on different people's behaviors. Keep an eye out on kind of your own emotional state and how that's manifesting and how that's showing to perhaps athletes that are around you. We want to be prepared for a wide range of potential emotions. And I know you've probably all heard this so many times, but this pandemic is something we've not experienced before. That this word unprecedented, quite frankly, I'm getting to the point where I don't like hearing that word anymore, because I've heard it so many times. But it's true, it's unprecedented, and so we can't expect to know and predict how people are going to feel, because it's not necessarily something that we've experienced before. So keeping this in mind, expectations for the first few training sessions, or the first few times that you get together with athletes or small training groups again, should be kept very low. So if small groups of athletes and coaches are training together, it's really important to give everybody time to reconnect with each other and with the training environment. This reconnection is important for managing emotions and managing potential fears. It's also important to adapt to the new training environment, because for I would say for the vast majority, there's going to be some range of different adaptations required to new training and whatnot, whether it's, you know, the use of masks or the use of space or cleaning of equipment, not being able to get closer than 6 feet from each other. That's going to require some new habits to be formed and some new adaptations. So it's important to allow some time and some space, some emotional and psychological time and space to manage that, that additional kind of mental capacity that it's going to take to get used to that training environment. That's going to be very different in some cases from pre-isolation. So for each phase, what I'm going to do is kind of explain a little bit like I have, and then I'm going to provide some tips, some things to keep in mind for coaches as you move through these phases with your athletes and perhaps with other coaches and staff. So the first bit is, of course, be prepared to listen. So when I say, you know, the importance or the priority here should be focusing on reconnection, even just providing the athletes and yourself time to talk. Athletes might need to talk, to vent, to talk about what they've lived in isolation, to socialize. Even if you've been in contact virtually or electronically with your athletes, it's going to be kind of this weird reconnection to see each other in person again. So allowing for that time and space is going to be really important. So again, paying attention to body language, pay attention to what people are communicating with you and how they're communicating and what might seem they may or may not be comfortable with. So that's going to be important to observe. Again, prioritizing relationships and reconnection over training. So I would say the first week or two, training, probably not the biggest priority. You know, we want to come back and kind of get back into some kind of, I hate to say normalcy, but some kind of reconnection and socialization. So this idea of re-socializing before we shift focus to training. So again, the first, I'll just get all of these down here. The expectations for the first few trainings should be low. This reconnection is really important to managing the emotions and also managing fear. And we also want to help athletes put everything into perspective, and understanding that there should be, you know, there's benefits sometimes to rest and recovery for an extended period of time. So some other points here on the screen: share information and use facts as much as possible. Avoid using opinions, because the chances are the people that you're reconnecting with are looking for information and are getting information from different places. So if you're going to share information, use facts and avoid opinions. Use information from trusted sources. Helping athletes visualize a new training environment is also going to be helpful. So examples that we're using, for example, in gymnastics, is taking videos of the gym and, you know, the process by which the athletes have to go through when they enter the facility, or when, you know, where the equipment will be, what will it look like? You know, if you're going to be training outdoors, what's that going to look like? If you're going to have kind of tape or paint on the ground, what will that look like? Really taking any of the guesswork out for both yourselves as coaches and for your athletes is going to be helpful. So again, using examples, videos, visuals, so that they can understand the changes before training begins. So making sure everything is as clear as possible before even the first training session. We want to, coming back to kind of the emotional side, we want to manage any extremes. So extreme happiness, excitement to come back, or extreme kind of anxiousness and worry about coming back, with some empathy and some understanding. And understanding that you as a coach might not have that same emotion or feeling as your athletes or your coaching staff, or the parents that you might be interacting with as well. Modeling good behavior is going to be very important. That kind of goes without saying as a coach, but you yourselves following public health guidelines and, you know, conversations with coaches and athletes. Like I said, we're so habituated into doing things a certain way that, you know, following public health guidelines is a lot about creating new habits. So being very conscious of what you're doing and knowing that everybody's is watching. So making sure that you're aware of the public health guidelines, the protocols set by your provincial sport organization, or your club or whatnot, and making sure that you're modeling that behavior so athletes can see what they should also be doing. And lastly, these 2 points for this particular phase: be compassionate towards others and yourselves. Don't be afraid to give yourself a break, and don't be too hard on yourselves. Everybody has gone through is going through a global pandemic. And I think we have to kind of acknowledge that sometimes. And, you know, this is a crisis, it's a major disruption, which is going to bring about some emotions and some mental fatigue or exhaustion. So it's important to understand that you need to be compassionate and understanding for others, but also for yourself. So don't be afraid to give yourself a break. And if you do need support, you know, reach out if you work with a mental performance consultant, or if you know any professionals in mental health, or even if you just need to talk it out with another coach and kind of compare notes and talk about kind of venting or anything like that. Make sure that you do reach out if you do need some extra support. All right, so that's the emotional phase. And before I go into the next phase, it's interesting because some sports in some parts of the country or whatnot have returned back for a week or so. I've had the chance to talk to some coaches already, and one coach in particular I had a conversation with on Friday of last week. He had started coaching on Monday, and this is a sport that's kind of more one-on-one type of outdoor coaching. So the coaching environment hadn't really changed all that much, but this particular coach had spent the last, 12, 13 weeks at home, not working, and at home with 2 very small children. So you can imagine there's a lot of kind of exhaustion at the end of the day and tiredness. And what he communicated to me was that even though, he spent all that fantastic time with his family and was really happy to, but he was really tired, his first 2 days back of coaching on the Monday and Tuesday, he was more exhausted at the end of the day than he had been while interacting for 3 months with his small children. So just understanding that the reintegration and coming out of isolation and re-socializing with other people after not doing that for a few months really is taxing on your emotional capacity. So you might find yourself fatigued and wondering, like, why am I so tired? It's because we're interacting with more people now, something that we haven't done for a long time. So that fatigue is real. And I'll get into a little bit more as we go through along these different phases. So the second phase is when we reconstruct our meaning. So if motivation and commitment have not been affected, they can be a source of energy, and they can be a source of, can stimulate resources. However, if you're in a position, or you have athletes in a position where their motivation or commitment has changed, there's potential for exhaustion, potential for, lack of effectiveness. And that's when some of the other more intense emotions or feelings such as distress, fear, anxiety, and even mood swings can be a part of this phase. We try to seek meaning and try to figure out what exactly are we doing. And in this rational phase, we're really shifting a little bit more into start to train. So the first phase, the focus was on reconnecting, not so much training. Now we're shifting to return to train, and kind of getting back to that procedure or pathway to performance. Training has to be progressive. Athletes and coaches have to be adaptable. And one of the really cool things I've noticed, even during the isolation period, being, checking social media, is that athletes and coaches have been really creative in how we've adapted and kind of trained in isolation. And that's important to continue doing, because as we move forward into releasing some of the restrictions, it's going to be more of like a hybrid type of training, at least in the first little bit. We can't go back all the way that we were before the isolation period. So understanding that creativity is going to be really important, collaboration is going to be really important, adaptability is going to be really important. But if you're able or have the means to, or any resources to do any measurement, baseline assessment and tracking, that's going to be helpful for the athletes and the coaches to understand where athletes stand, and then be able to set some realistic goals and, of course, avoid any injuries. One of the major messages that we've been trying to communicate is that, you know, returning to play or returning to sport participation, one of the biggest goals is to prevent any injury, both physically but also emotionally. We don't want to get into a burnout type of phase, particularly because we've been stressed. Even though we've been in isolation, we've been stressed, and there's potential for burnout. So we want to make sure that training is progressive and that we're adaptable. So again, expectations should be manageable. Athletes are unlikely to be at the same level as of their kind of abilities or conditioning as pre-isolation, or they might be actually advanced depending on the sport and depending on the context in which they've been in isolation. So, you know, even though they might not be where they were pre-isolation, if they've been exercising, they're probably not as far away as they might think. And by any means, athletes don't lose their skills within a couple months. Now, they will be rusty, but you can't lose a skill in that period of time. Athletes and coaches are going to, again, have different levels of motivation, particularly if there's no set plan or calendar or schedule for the next competition. So thinking about maintaining that motivation by setting some short-term, very performance process-oriented goals, because our outcome goal, the finish line, the thing that gets us up in the morning to motivate us, is a little fuzzy still right now. So really focusing on performance goals and process goals are going to be important. And it's also a really, you know, good time or opportunity to think of, you know, why do I love my sport so much? What is it about this sport that I enjoy so much? And kind of rekindling that relationship with your sport. So again, I might sound like I'm repeating some things, but I only repeat because they're really important. But the need to be adaptable is so important, as you know, as we move forward, whether or not restrictions come back or not, we need to be mentally prepared for that possibility as well. So again, some tips for coaches for the rational phase. The biggest danger here is overtraining in the athlete and burnout in the coach. You know, as coaches, you're used to coaching, and then you're probably not coaching for a little bit. And but that doesn't mean, again, that you weren't stressed. And now all of these restrictions and these new protocols and everything, that can be taxing in different ways of how you coach. So we're already seeing at a national level some high levels of burnout in our coaches already. And we haven't really been coming back to training for that long length of time yet. So just being aware of that, and that's what we want to prevent. So being aware of athletes and coaches who want to come back too quickly or too intensely, or just kind of want to turn the page too quickly. We have to remember that recovery is still as essential to training as it is the physical training itself. You know, we might want to come back too quick, even in terms of coaching. If you haven't been able to coach, and if you rely on coaching as a source of income, we might want to kind of overcompensate, and just being aware of how that will be in terms of stress and energy on our systems. So even though throughout the isolation, just going to get these down on the screen, even though through isolation we might not have been expending as much as physical energy as we certainly have been expending more mental and emotional mental and emotional energy throughout this isolation. And it's important to understand that energy is energy is energy. And kind of what I was referring to with my example of the coach who was fatigued after the first couple days back. You know, understanding that you are going to be tired, and making sure that you're taking some time to rest and recuperate as well. So still plan on training breaks, periodization. Isolation was not a holiday, even though you may or may not have still been working. I know some of you are probably working in even tougher circumstances, which is even more exhausting. So keeping all of those situations in mind. Keep working on the things that you might have been helping your athletes to work on during the isolation. Recovery, mental skills, any tactical stuff. And still try to keep connected through virtual meetings or electronically in a safe capacity. Because this is more going to be like a hybrid type of adjustment. We're not going to go straight back to where we were in terms of access in training time. So think about it as a gradual transition. And some more tips here, being okay with the unknown. And I think in my conversations with a lot of individuals, not just coaches and athletes, it's the fact that we don't know that's sometimes the most worrisome or anxiety inducing, and getting comfortable with that. I realize this is a lot easier said than done, but you know, understanding that it's okay that we don't know, and to not look more forward than maybe a couple weeks in terms of planning. But informing yourself with facts and science, again, using really reliable sources of information, avoiding opinions. Recognize the resources that you do have within yourself, within, you know, parents, within coaching staff, within your athletes. Recognize what you do have as opposed to what you're restricted or don't have, which then kind of forces us to think outside the box, forces us to be creative and adaptive, and those are all really good things. Make sure that you and your athletes together, if you're setting goals, play an active role in the goal setting process, and understanding that kind of the finish line or the outcome goal might vary to what it maybe looked like in March. But understanding that no matter what you're doing and no matter what the outcome goal is, the training and the participation is still an investment into a future goal. Okay. And then finding your why, which is something I mentioned a little bit earlier, understanding, you know, this is might be a really good time, or it has been, the isolation might be a good time to really reflect on, why do I coach? Why am I participating in this? Think about what you've missed the most if you haven't been coaching where you maybe usually would have been coaching. And a time to really reflect on the whole, your whole why or your reason for coaching. All right, moving on to our last phase here, which is the action phase, where, you know, the emotional phase was more about reconnecting. The rational phase, we're transitioning. When we get to the action phase, which might just be, you know, a month, 4 weeks or so, or maybe 2 weeks into the whole return to participation, is where we really start thinking about refocusing on peak performance. So refocusing on actual training to reach a particular goal. So this is where we put into action your training plan, again, to reach your goal. And understanding that your yearly training plan might look very different because we don't have necessarily competitions on the near horizon. So understanding that. We're using a lot in these conversations or discussion a parallel between return to training after isolation with return from injury. So returning from an injury is very similar to returning from isolation. However, there are some really important differences that we have to note, because those can make a significant difference in terms of how we react to that. So again, the similarities are important in terms of having to come back gradually and setting a lot of short-term goals. However, the biggest difference is when you're coming back from injury, you're probably not at 100% when you start coming back. So we're very cautious, and it feels okay to take things a little bit gradually because physically we might not be 100%. The case of coming back from isolation is that you might have athletes who feel fantastic. They might feel better than they were before going into isolation because they've had more time to rest, more time to recuperate. So they might feel like they can come back and really, guns a-blazing, I feel great, and want to try all these things or kind of come back to where they would have when isolation was first initiated. So being aware of that and really focusing again on this gradual approach. Use your mental skills, creativities, and all lessons that have been learned from isolation and transferring those into the training environment. This last phase, or the third phase, is that of kind of this new balance, this new next. In the mental performance community, everybody's talking about a new normal. We're actually trying to stay away from the word normal and think about the new next phase. Because, hey, normal, what does that actually mean? So the emergence of new meaning and reintegration. So some tips for this particular phase. I talked about, reflecting on what the lessons have been and your why during isolation. Participate in some exercises or activities that are going to help you identify these lessons through storytelling, for example. So one of the things that I've asked some athletes to do is write a letter to themselves pre-COVID. So, I think it was around March 15th-ish, around that time, where things started to look like, oh, I think I'm going to have to grab stuff from my office because I might not get there in a little while. So if you could write yourself a letter to the person you were March 10th, for example, what would you say in that letter? What would you want to tell that person? What do you wish you knew then that you know now? What have you learned? What are the things that you're going to take away from this experience and use? If we can come out of this and see this as an opportunity, and not necessarily a detriment, but an opportunity to move forward, how are you going to take advantage of this opportunity and apply that in future coaching? Again, use the resources at your disposal, that was a typo, as much as possible. So use the resources that you have. Again, be creative and don't necessarily think about resources that cost money. Think about, what your own knowledge is. If you've done any professional development, kind of go back and look at your workbooks even, and think about what you as a coach and your experience know. Trust the process. It's going to be a process. I know for me personally, going into this, if you would have said this was going to be, a 13-week type of process so far, and we're not close to being done, I probably would have scoffed and laughed a little bit. But it is a process, and we've gotten through it. So thinking about, what long-term, medium-term, and short-term goals you can think of. And I've said this a few times already, but stick to the facts and the science. And the beauty here is in that what we have to remember is that science evolves. So being open to the idea that what science told us a month ago is not what science might tell us now, but understanding that that's how science works. So making sure that you're using information and facts from chief medical officers, whether they be your provincial CMOs, whether it be your national sport organization CMOs, or whatnot. Stick to some reliable information and avoid opinions. Measuring your progress, training and recovery, and also celebrating your successes. Because we're focusing more on short-term process performance goals, it's really important to kind of write that down, track it, and then when you've reached the goal, make sure that you celebrate that success. And not rely on outcomes or competitions to really measure your success. Make sure that you're measuring your success on a short-term basis, so that you have something to kind of build upon and feel confident with. And again, this idea of not falling back into old habits. Use those lessons learned. integrate the new habits, new values, new ways of doing things, new knowledge, new skills as you move forward. Bottom line here, and one thing that I haven't necessarily mentioned yet is the importance of communication. But first and foremost, I think everybody, athletes, coaches, staff, parents, should participate at the level at which you're comfortable, and understanding that everybody might have a different comfort level, and to not feel pressured and to not pressure people who might not be comfortable in that moment, and that's okay. So participate at the level at which you're comfortable, and communicate your comfort level and your needs to those around you so that everybody is clear. We've been communicating with athletes that they need to be clear with their coaches and staff of what they're comfortable with and what they need to be successful. And I communicate the exact same thing to coaches. As a coach, what do you need from your athletes to feel comfortable? And even expressing the why behind that, and why it's important, and what you need as a coach to feel comfortable and be able to run, for example, a successful practice with the increased restrictions. You or your athletes are not behind. This is not a race. Nobody's racing to come back, even though we're eager or might be eager to come back. It's not a race. We want to make sure that the health and safety, physically, emotionally, and psychologically are a first priority. And think of this as a marathon and less of a sprint if you are going to think of it as a race. What we do at the very beginning might have very little impact in the grand scheme of things. So understanding that you're not behind, you've not lost your skills, and keeping that in mind as we move forward. So at this time, that's what I have for presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm actually gonna, if that's okay, Kirsty, I'm gonna stop sharing the slide, and if anybody has any specific questions, I can go back to screen sharing. But at this point, if anybody has any questions or even wants to discuss anything, any specifics, I'm happy to talk about that.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fine, Lori. You can close that so you can see everyone and see the chat box. So thank you so much, Lori. And like she said, if any of you guys have questions, feel free to use the chat box or unmute yourselves and speak up. I will say there is one comment in here from a coach who has already returned to training, and their plan is 8 weeks. So very gradual.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think from a physical perspective, we might understand that, but understanding that from a mental perspective, it's still going to be exhausting, and the readjustment is going to need to be gradual as well. Even if you think of how you needed to adjust being in isolation and how that took maybe a couple of weeks, mm-hmm. Think of it in the same way as we're coming out of what we've now been in a habit of a couple months. So it's going to take some more readjustment as well.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Christy. Hi, Lori. How are you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. My question is for Lori. Lori, my question is, we all know that kids will come back and they will be so happy and energetic, wants to play right away. But what are some things I have to keep in mind to slow them down? What do?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question that I think a lot of coaches are going to be wondering about. So thank you for that. And I think first and foremost, if you can communicate ahead of time before they get to the first practice in terms of expectations, and what the plan is for the first day, what you're going to be doing and how you're going to do that, that's going to kind of help mitigate some of that energy, but also allowing some time for them to just be really happy and talk to people. So that idea of coming back to reconnecting, but being very clear in kind of communicating, look, if we go too hard now, you're going to be really tired next week. And we want to make sure that, we don't do too much today, that you won't be able to do anything at all tomorrow. And I think most athletes can relate to that feeling of, oh, I did too much today, so I'm super sore tomorrow. And that comes, that can be related to the mental aspect as well. If you do too much kind of interacting on one day when you haven't done any at all, and then the next day you're mentally exhausted. So it's the same idea, but I think communication is going to be really key and helpful.
Hi, Lori.
Hi, Jared.
What would you recommend for athletes who hit a physical plateau returning to sports? So say you're back in your training environment for 3-4 weeks, maybe even 7 weeks, and athletes have seemed to be going well, and then they hit a point where they either can't progress to the point that they were before, or are there already faster than expected, but aren't necessarily ready to take on new things.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think, take the pandemic away, that's a really stressful and frustrating circumstance for sure. And I think as coaches and athletes, we've all kind of experienced those types of plateaus. So we can approach it the same way as we would without the global pandemic factor in it, and kind of even just simplifying. One way of doing kind of simplifying and really thinking of process and what to do. And if you've managed to kind of keep track on a long, that tracking and monitoring, you can have the athlete kind of take a step back and see, okay, maybe these last couple days have been frustrating and plateaued, but over the course of the last 6 weeks, I've actually progressed quite a bit. And what that does is kind of shifts that, oh my God, I suck type of feeling, I can't progress, to, oh my God, look at how far I've actually come. It's not that big of a deal. And I realize that's a lot easier said than done, particularly working with some athletes that might be very motivated to develop. The other side of that is that might be a really good time to think of creativity. And if the isolation has given us anything, it's the opportunity to be creative and adaptable. So think of, what can you do to shake things up? Take the monotony out of it, because the reality is it's going to be monotonous if there's no competitions, and there's a risk of things kind of wearing off pretty quickly. The enthusiasm and excitement of coming back, that might wear off into week 6, 7, and 8. And that's where you might actually see the plateaus. And while they might be separate, they might be highly related to one another. So from a coaching perspective, think about cross-training opportunities, shake things up, try to make things a bit fun, and just say, okay, well, you've been working at this for a long period of time. Let's see if we can do something different, shift our focus a little bit, and see where we can go. And it really comes down to shifting focus, and not so much the athlete focusing on what they can't do or haven't been able to do for a little bit. And then they can come back with kind of fresh energy after a little while.
Thank you.
Great questions, guys, and thank you, Lori. We do have one in the chat box, so I'll read it out loud. How do we convince local associations to adopt this principle of return to play? I'm in a battle with my local association, and I seem to be the lone voice in all the noise.
So just for clarification, in terms of this gradual return, I'm assuming that's the question. Local associate. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I get the. Thank you for that. Zoom is wonderful in some instances. Yeah, I would. That's a tough one, and I can feel the frustration being in that scenario. If you're the lone wolf saying, no, we need to do this gradually and gradually. What is kind of going in everybody's favor for this argument is the restrictions that are required. The science kind of shows it. If you're looking for some data, in my conversation with one of the strength and conditioning coaches at the sports center, we're seeing kind of the data coming out of even professional leagues that have returned with an abbreviated training camp. And I will preface this by saying I'm a mental performance consultant and am not an expert in physical training by any means at all. But if we look at, for example, the German soccer league, which was one of the first professional leagues to come back, they had a very abbreviated training camp before they started competing back to normal games. And from what I've heard from my strength and conditioning colleagues is that the incident of injury, physical injury in the first couple weeks was like 4 to 5 times greater than a normal season. So if you're looking at those types of examples, there is data there to support this kind of gradual return. Heck, show them this YouTube video once it's been recorded. And you know, what we're seeing, even, you know, people going back to work, the fatigue is there. And even anecdotally, I mean, even for me, going back out to, you know, even just meeting up with friends in my bubble, after that first day was exhausting. And a good exhaustion. Like it's not a bad feeling, but it's still this fatigue. That you're like, wow, I don't have energy. I'm really happy because I got to interact with people, but I'm tired. So understanding that whole process, and the goal should be prevention of injury, and that is both a physical and a psychological implication. If you are mentally fatigued, you're at a greater risk for physical injury. And if you go too hard, too fast, you're going to see a lot more injuries, which is what the data is telling us. I hope that was helpful. I understand and recognize the frustration that is, and I would say keep pushing.
Yeah, they said amen. Thanks for that. Yeah, it's funny. That was my like reaction when they asked that question, was science and this YouTube video.
Yeah.
So a coach private messaged me saying, great suggestions that I can use with mature/adult athletes. Do you have anything specific to motivate and comfort adult athletes to return?
Oh yeah, that's good. I think the hope and the assumption is that when working with more adult level of athletes, hopefully the assumption is that there's a greater ability to rationalize, and being more self-aware and being better able to articulate feelings and emotions. Understanding that that's not the case for everybody, but even just having those conversations, and that communication part is going to be really, really important. And I think as a coach, it's okay to communicate your own vulnerabilities, and that might be easier to do with adult athletes as well. And just being able to communicate that with them and just say, look, we're in this together. We're going to kind of navigate this together, and whatever you're comfortable with is good. And understanding that, I think from an IST perspective, or people who are working with coaches and athletes, particularly from the mental perspective, we understand that coaches are probably more stressed than they usually are during these circumstances. And just, you know, communication, or communicating with some coaches this week, you know, a lot of coaches going back are anxious and stressed, and being vulnerable with your adult athletes is probably going to be more productive than you might think, and having that open communication is really important. So one, being honest and having open communication, so that they can feel comfortable. But in terms of the tips that I've gone over in the presentation, I think they're relevant for athletes of any age, just having to adapt the level of communication and concepts and stuff for the appropriate age group.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lori. And someone just commented, my biggest stress was the athletes not following or sticking to their protocols. So yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely. And you know, I think the communication ahead of time is really important, and the videos and everything, and understanding, making sure they understand the why behind having to do this. You need to stay 6 feet apart because if you don't, we might not be able to come back and play. And that is a reality. It's not necessary. It's not like a threat. It's an actual fact and reality, and understanding that that is the case. But also understanding, and depending on the age group as well. But I think you can have this conversation at any age group, just depending on the language that you choose, and saying, you know, everybody might feel a bit different. So you have to be kind and understanding that everybody needs their space. And that's okay. And we can still have fun 6 feet apart. And this is how it's going to go. And from a coach, it's tricky and sometimes frustrating, because you know that, you know, each child might be getting a different message from home, which is why you want to kind of stick to facts and public health and understanding these are the rules. And I think if we can communicate ahead of time, again, making it clear what the expectations are, having the conversation with the parents, and understanding that if we don't follow these protocol, you're not going to be able to participate. You know, and I say that in a non-threatening way, because it is the truth. It's the reality.
Great, thank you, Lori, and thank you everyone for the questions. If you have any last questions or comments, feel free to write it in the chat box now, or open your mic. We'll just wait another minute or two, but thank you so much, Lori, and thank you everyone for attending. We're really excited to have everyone on here and discuss such an important topic. Another question just came in, so I'll read that.
Sure.
Given the unknown, short term is key to planning. How do we approach the medium term is the fall, given the public discussion of the next wave?
Yeah, this is the conversation now as we're coming out of the first wave. You know, we keep thinking, oh, okay, well, in the messaging from public health is we need to be vigilant to prevent a second wave. So that's obviously in our focus right now. I think to manage that type of information and that stress is if you can keep the focus on a short term, and we're at the point now where short term can be more than a week, because there was a time period where, you know, we could really only think weeks at a time. And we're at the point now where we're thinking, I mean, also depending on where you're located, we're thinking in 2-3 weeks periods now instead of 1 week period. And that's okay. So that's a decent short term. When we think medium term, I think having a plan A and a plan B and a plan C is going to make you feel prepared and in somewhat control. The reason why the unknown and the unpredictable causes worry and anxiety is because we don't have control. And I'll speak for myself, but as a sport person and as a coach, I like some control. I like feeling in control. And not knowing and not having control during these last couple of months has probably been one of the bigger sources of fear or worry or anxiety. So trying to think of how can you regain some level of control, and that is, okay, plan A, best case scenario. What is it going to look like? Plan B, less best case scenario, to the point where you say, okay, if worst case scenario, if we are in a second wave in the fall and we're back to not being able to participate at whatsoever, being prepared now, because we've gone through it once, we're better prepared to go through it the next time. So having different plans and feeling like you have some form of preparation for different scenarios will regain your control, and then hopefully reduce some level of anxiety or stress.
Great, thanks, Lori. And again, if anyone has any last questions, feel free to write them in the chat box or open up your mic. But we will start to wrap up. And if you do have a question, I'll read it aloud. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks again, Lori. We're really happy to have these sessions and for everyone to be joining across the country. It's so great to see. And we do have another session tomorrow night at 8 p.m. with Melissa, who's a dietitian at Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. So she's going to be discussing youth versus elite athlete nutrition, which was suggested by a couple coaches. And I will say too, there for Nova Scotian coaches and any other coaches that want to join in, there's actually a session at 7 p.m. tonight by Basketball Nova Scotia, and I'll just put the link in the chat box here. Anyone's free to register, and there's a panel of 5 coaches in Nova Scotia who are visible minorities, and they're going to be discussing discrimination and racism. So I think it'll be a really great panel. So if you do have an hour tonight, definitely check that out. And if not, they're recording it and we're going to share it on our YouTube page. So make sure you look out for it there. What time? It's on in like 3 minutes, like at 7 p.m. So if you are interested, you can register there. And if you don't get the link, just email me and I can send it to you. But for tonight, thank you so much. And hopefully everyone can join us again tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. And thanks again, Lori.
Thank you, everybody. If anything, remember we are going back to training, and that's a good thing. So enjoy and be safe. Thanks for having me.